Hi everyone, this is my first time at VanQ as well, so this is a really neat experience for me as well. First of all, before we really get started, I would like a show of hands for people. If you already have some knowledge of accessibility, raise your hand. Who's never really experienced accessibility at all? Okay. Some of you can. So hopefully I'm not going to cover too much information that you already know. The goal of this presentation is to really show you three different things. The first is what is accessibility. I'm going to cover the basic parameters of what we mean by when we say the term accessibility. We're also going to talk about automated scanning software, since the software is a critical component of how we test for accessibility issues and remediation, and manual testing, because automation can only get you so far. You also need to do some manual testing for your products, because the experiences that people with accessibility issues face can only really be identified, and the experience that those people face, you really have to experience in order to truly understand the obstacles that they face with most technologies that they have. So let's jump into what is accessibility. So accessibility is about taking all people into consideration when designing buildings, information, or products. One of the other terms that can be used for discussing accessibility is inclusive design. That's a term that's come out of the entire spectrum of academics who deal with issues related to accessibility. But we, since we're testers, are going to be primarily covering web accessibility. There's no reason for us to talk about architecture, because we're testers, so we're going to be focusing on software. So the first thing that we can do when we're talking about accessibility is talk about the terminology that's associated with that. The first term I would like to introduce you to is assistive technology. Any person who has an accessibility issue will rely on some form of accessibility technology, or assistive technology. And assistive technologies are actually a really broad category. Glasses are a form of assistive technology. The history of assistive technologies goes back pretty far. Glasses were invented in the 1200s. The typewriter, as we know it today, was initially invented by Pellegrino Turri in the 1800s because his lover was blind and he wanted to get letters from her. So he invented a typewriter so she could write it to him. And that's a really kind of amazing, powerful thing. The telephone is also another form of assistive technology when it was initially developed. Alexander Graham Bell was thinking that the telephone could aid people with auditory issues by amplifying the sound of people's voices and therefore enabling them to communicate better. Another assistive technology that's a little more recent than the telephone is email. We're webcasting this to the TV, so there's a little bit of a lag. Vint Cerf, one of the fathers of the internet, developed email because he himself had auditory issues, and his wife was fully deaf for a while. And he developed email with the notion of being able to communicate with her throughout the day, because they obviously couldn't call each other. So email and networked computing was the way in which he could envision a future in which he and his wife could communicate effectively. And so the amazing thing about assistive technologies is that people are often the forerunners of technologies that become commonplace for everyone else down the road. When we talk about disabilities, though, we also need to contextualize the totality of disabilities. And since we are in Vancouver and in Canada, we can look at the statistics from Statistics Canada regarding the amount of people that face disabilities or that have disabilities and the types of disabilities that they have. This comes directly from Statistics Canada survey on disability from 2012. So this is the most recent data that we have on the total amount of Canadians that have disabilities. One of the things I want you to notice is, if you can read the screen, is at the bottom is that there's a little note that says the sum of all individual disability types is greater than the number of total disabilities. So disabilities are not singular. Someone can be deaf and blind. Someone may have motor issues and cognitive issues. So we need to make sure that we deal with the spectrum of disabilities in their totality. The neat thing, though, is that we can actually group all disabilities into 4 basic categories. The first being motor issues, And you can see that motor shows up right at the top. It's related to mobility and pain and flexibility, auditory, hearing issues. We also have visual issues related to seeing. And last of all, we also have cognitive issues. So that means people who have dyslexia or other types of cognitive issues that make it difficult for them to understand or retain information. Someone with a form of head trauma that has short-term memory technically falls under this category of cognitive. One of the things that we also can do is address the issue of disability by looking at legislation that has come down the road that deals with the fact that our built world did not take people with disabilities into consideration. The first of such legislation came from the United States. It's called Section 508, and it was amended in 1973. And Section 508 is still in use today. If you have products that are sold in the United States, they technically have to be compliant with Section 508. So this is the first critical piece of accessibility legislation that impacts web accessibility. In the UK, there was a Disability Discrimination Act of 1995. And when we get closer to the web, we have the World Wide Web Consortium, which writes the specifications for how we address accessibility within the internet. So they first wrote the Web Content Accessibility Guidelines, otherwise known as WCAG. I prefer WCAG, but that's the term that the community uses. And the first one emerged in 1999. So the date of this is also significant because the web has changed dramatically since 1999. So they did a revamp of the guidelines in 2008. However, technology has changed radically since 2008. What's the primary technology that has emerged since that period? Yeah, mobile. So the rules for WCAG 2.0 had no mobile into consideration, the same way that the rules from 1999 had no CSS because CSS didn't exist. So the mobile shows up in 2015, so that's still very new. The specifications for that are still being disseminated throughout the community. WCAG 2.0 is based on 3 different compliance levels, the first being A, the second being AA, and the third being AAA. The compliance levels are progressively restrictive in the sense that they keep getting more and more stringent the further down the road you go. So A is the sort of basic level of compliance. AA starts getting a lot more stringent in terms of that certain things that were not, that didn't have specific parameters like the contrast ratio for colors on a screen suddenly start to get specific parameters at AA. And at AAA, things start to get really stringent. And however, the one caveat to that is that not everybody should adhere to all parameters of AAA because they may actually contradict things. So you really have to be selective and cognizant of how you approach AAA level compliance. And not everybody can hit AAA, and they acknowledge that. That is baked into the rule set. However, in Canada, you'll notice that we have nothing for Canada so far until 2005. Ontario is the first province in the whole of Canada to have any sort of legislation regarding accessibility. The first set of it really kicked into gear for people dealing with the web in 2014, which was the first year in which every organization in Ontario had to start adhering to level A. However, they only had to adhere to new websites or pages built after 2012. So anything built before 2012 doesn't have to adhere to A, but anything built after does. And that means anything that also faces a significant redesign. So currently, this is the only law in Ontario, or the only law in Canada that we have to be concerned with. And I'm concerned with it because our products are sold in Ontario, so I'm very aware of what's going on there. And the other thing that's really interesting about AOTA is that it's progressive. So currently, the level is A. In 2021, it's AA, and so my role here is to make sure that we are compliant on that day one. And it's going to be a road. It's especially with the contrast ratios, whenever you're dealing with branding, that starts to get really finicky, and people are very tied to their brand. So you want to be careful that if you're telling them that your brand is actually inaccessible, that you give them a really long leeway, because they don't want to change their brands. Brands are a very critical component of any organization. So I'm very worried about that restriction, because as the accessibility specialist here, it'll be my role to make sure that all of the credit unions that we deal with understand that this is going to be a very stringent requirement that they actually technically have to adhere to. All right. So the key thing about this is be aware of the jurisdictions that your products fall under. I don't know everybody here, so I'm not sure if your products cross international lines, or you maybe have products that are in Ontario, or maybe you're just in BC. In BC, we have no legislation relating to the WCAG guidelines. However, there are rumblings of a federal disability act, so that may be coming down the pipeline. But so I'm keeping aware of that. But as of right now, there is no federal law and there's no provincial law that makes you adhere to any of these parameters. All right. So let's move on to layers of guidance, because the WCAG guidelines are based on a series of guidelines that actually kind of nest into each other. So the first thing we have are principles. And these principles are perceivable, operable, understandable, and robust. Next, we have the guidelines that slot in underneath that. So these guidelines are 12 basic goals that fit in underneath these 4 principles. And the guidelines themselves have a set of success criteria. Yay, success criteria for testers, right? We all really need our parameters for what is considered a success or a failure. And the good thing is the guidelines present that for us. The other thing that they provide is a set of advisory techniques, some of which are sufficient and some of which are advisory. So there's the level at which you have adhered to the guideline, and then there's also some advisory guidelines that you need to be cognizant of, but they're not requirements. This is what the actual is. Okay. This is what the actual guidelines look like, and you can see that they are nested. We have our principle here at the top. So you see that the first principle is perceivable. The next thing below, we have our guideline, which fleshes out what the basic principle is. And there we go, the guideline. And then below it, you'll see that we have our success criteria. So these are the actual parameters that you have to test against. And lastly, we have a set of techniques. So they're the how to meet in the side, and those actually get into much more detail. That's why they're a link and not nested within this document. Next, we'll discuss the 4 principles of accessibility. So you saw before that the principles were listed for you. Now let's get into what they actually mean and how they're handled within the documentation. So the first one, perceivable. It means that the content and UI are present and displayed without losing meaning. So that means that if the user has some sort of assistive technology that changes the way that the appearance is, or some people actually shut off JavaScript entirely, you want to be sure that your content can still be presented and perceivable to people. Next is operable. So that means that people can use and manipulate your content with only a keyboard. This is a really critical one that a lot of people and a lot of websites are still struggling with. And this is a major hurdle for people who rely entirely on keyboard navigation. And this, we're not talking about people who are entirely blind. There are also people with motor issues as well, who have very limited functions with their hands. But at the same time, the technology is there now to support people. Next is understandable. So make sure that text and content looks and acts predictably. So this is largely for people with cognitive issues. If you have dyslexia, consistent text is really, really important for them, or making sure that text is left aligned and doesn't have any weird spacing, because they're looking for consistent words, because they're not actually reading specific words, they're looking at the overall context of sentences, because they also know that they can't trust what they're seeing. Some of them even actually use assistive technologies like screen readers to verify the content on the screen. So again, that's that multiplicity of disability that we have to take into consideration. And lastly, we need to make sure that things are robust, meaning that when future assistive technologies show up, that your content can actually work with it. And so that means that the WCAG specification is really invested in making sure that you're adhering to basic web development principles and making sure that you have a very straightforward DOM, because that'll mean that you're future-proofing yourself for whatever changes come down the pipeline. If you'll notice though, these 4 principles of accessibility also map back to our 4 types of disability, so perceivable and visual. We also have motor and operable. We also have understandable and cognitive. And lastly, we also have auditory, which kind of fits in with all of these, but also if you have good auditory support, then that means that your system is probably fairly robust. So you can cover all 4 by following these 4 principles. Moving ahead, let's look at the specific guidelines themselves. So we'll take a first look at what's perceivable, because it's important to get a much closer understanding of what each of these guidelines contain. So we'll look at the 12 here. So we need to make sure that for perceivable that there's text alternatives. So if you have content that's entirely visual, like say an image, that has some sort of textual representation, so a screen reader can pick it up, or if someone is deafblind and only able to use a braille reader for navigating the web, that they understand the content that you're presenting to them through Braille. And the good thing is that you don't have to worry about Braille at all. A lot of times the software just entirely takes care of that for you based on the screen reader just interpreting that to the Braille reader. So the good thing is that as long as your content is clean and clear, you don't have to worry about things like Braille or how a Braille reader operates, because if you've made your content accessible, then the assistive technologies take care of the rest. Next is time-based media. So you need to provide an alternative for things that are sound or video. So that means that, because again, we would consider deafblind people, having a podcast doesn't help them. However, having a transcript of that really does help them. We need to make sure, the other thing about time-based media is that that's not something that we deal with at Central One, however you out there may. So this is a point where I actually completely ignore time-based media because it's not really a factor for us. Next is adaptable. So again, your content can be presented in different ways, either through simplification. Again, if that person shuts off JavaScript, what happens? Do you know what happens to your product if that happens? If someone has done that to their browser, that's a really critical thing, because you want to make sure that you can degrade your product gracefully so that you don't completely break everything once JavaScript is shut off. Next. And you want to make sure that your text is distinguishable. Sorry, I skipped it. Anyways, it's okay. Distinguishable just means that you need to make sure that you have good contrast ratios. Again, when we're talking about single A, they don't get very specific, but once you get drill down into double A, then it starts to you get specific ratios that you have to adhere. Next, let's look at operable. So operable deals with functionality, so we need to make sure that all content can be accessed through a keyboard. And this is actually a really challenging thing, because when we're talking about keyboard functionality, when someone is using a screen reader, if they get a pop-up dialog from your application, where does the focus go? Because you have an element that is focusing on the screen itself. And if you don't track that focus within that keyboard or within that dialog, the user can go off and then never find their way back into the dialogue, and there's no recovery from that. That's happened to me when I've done testing for myself, and it's really disorienting, because it's like having the pathway cut off from you. You suddenly have lost all context. However, keyboard traps are a trap. So you want to make sure that you're not trapping people inadvertently by having them get stuck someplace, because if your application creates a trap where someone gets stuck and they can't navigate their way back out using the keyboard, they're done. They're completely unable to complete their task. So you want to make sure that you avoid unnecessary keyboard traps that make it so that the keyboard functionality ceases to work. Next, you want to make sure that when you're presenting information to people, and if you want to make it operable, that you give them enough time to complete a task. Again, this is one that in our context at Central 1 is not an issue to me at all, because we don't put timers on the screen that causes things to stop. Yes, you can auto timeout, but there's no actual timer on the screen. I panic so much when I'm in the Ticketmaster app or the Cineplex app when it starts ticking down to like under a minute and I haven't completed my transaction. That really causes me a lot of anxiety. And if anybody deals with anything related to timers, I would love to talk to you, because dealing with this challenge of letting users reset that time is actually a really difficult thing, especially if it's baked into the system that you've got 5 minutes and this transaction will be killed if you don't make that timeline. So if there's anyone out there that has any advice on dealing with that, I'd really like to speak to them, because again, it's not something I have to deal with, but I'm curious, because as a user myself, I run into that, and if I have that anxiety, I can't imagine what it'd be like if you have a mobility issue and you touch slowly. That would be a real burden to someone. Next, make sure you don't give people seizures. When people who have epilepsy, if they see strobing lights, that can trigger them. So you want to make sure that you don't inadvertently cause seizures. And so the best way to avoid this is if you have a blinking element in your page, it doesn't blink at a ratio, nothing flashes faster than 3 times in 1 second. Anything above that threshold, you can trigger epilepsy. While we're on the subject of seizures, there's something that I have just come to really learn about in the last while, which are vestibular disorders that can be triggered through web animation. Basically, some people who have inner ear issues, if they see parallax scrolling that moves at an uncomfortable ratio for them, it can actually cause them to be nauseous for days. The challenge is that this is still very new, and this is largely related to web animations, so there's not a lot of parameters for testing this, but I just want people to be aware that this is a new issue that we've actually inadvertently created through the enhancements that we have gained in web animation. And lastly, when we're dealing with operability, we want to make sure that things are navigable so that people can find their way through something or recover where they are. If there's an error as they're filling out your form, can the system point them to where the error is and give them instructions for how to remediate that issue and then have them move on? If you can't see the screen and you have an error issue and you can't identify which field has the issue, that's a really big problem. That person cannot proceed in that task. Next, let's look at understandable. So we want to make sure that our text is readable. And this again falls back to the issue around people with dyslexia or other kinds of reading issues, or again also the contrast. You want to make sure that the language of the page is made explicit, so that way the screen reader knows what language the web page is operating under. Predictability is another major issue here. So you want to make sure that your pages are behaving in a consistent manner. Predictability is really critical. Again, people with cognitive issues will at times not be able to follow instructions if things shift around too much. And this is also a principle of good design. You want to make sure that your design is consistent. So a lot of these parameters really fall under things that are more in the territory of UI design versus the actual sort of testing. But there's these things really overlap when we're dealing with accessibility. So again, input assistance. You will see that some of these issues appear multiple times. So again, the labeling issue, making sure people don't get lost. Next, we'll deal with robust. And some of these are short, some of these sections are shorter than the other. So you want to make sure that your system is compatible, that you have an understanding of the types of user agents or assistive technologies that exist out there, and they will change on per platform basis. So we'll cover that later though. And, since we did talk about mobile before, let's get into how this WCAG 2.0 maps to mobile. So they still have the parameter of things being perceivable, and this is coming from the working draft from 2015. And if you see a number 2 there, it's because I'm actually following the numbering scheme from within the document. So that way you can go find these in that document if you're interested. You want to make sure that you're designing for a small screen size and that you're using the parameters of the small screen to the best abilities that you can. So that means minimizing information, making sure that things are at a reasonable default size. This also partially relates to zoom and magnification. So if you want to make sure that on a mobile device that your application doesn't, or your web page, doesn't shut off the zoom and magnification features that are baked into the operating system. And this is really critical for people, for everybody actually. That zoom feature is used by almost everyone, but people who are most impacted when it's shut off, and some developers do shut it off, it means that people can't resize the text and therefore they can't use your website. And that again falls into the AA. So currently in Ontario we don't have to worry about this, but we also don't do it. So at least that's a good thing for us. Again, dealing with the stringent contrast ratio, here's the actual ratio that you have to deal with when at the AA standard. You don't have to worry too much about knowing this in your mind. There's lots of online tools that will let you test colors against each other, and they'll tell you whether or not you pass or fail. You can sometimes even just enter in your web page, and it'll tell you what's in there. So next, let's deal with operability in mobile. So the thing that's interesting about operability in mobile is that issues around keyboard are still really important, because some people who have mobility issues still use keyboard controls, and you should be able to navigate an iOS application entirely from a keyboard. It's surprising actually to see how well certain things work when you attach a Bluetooth keyboard to an iPhone or an Android phone. So that keyboard accessibility is at level A, so that means that in Ontario this is currently active. Again, the keyboard trap in Ontario, you want to make sure you avoid that. Focus order is another one that is brought in over. That's really important in the sense that you want to make sure that there's a visible indicator as to where focus is on a page. And so that's a way in which you can visually recognize for someone who has low vision where focus is currently on a page. Oh, sorry, focus order is logical order, that the focus is moving in a logical manner. Focus visible is the next one, that you actually see a visible indicator. Sorry, I got those two mixed up. Next, touch target size and spacing. You want to make sure you adhere to the minimum level of touch target size, which is 9 millimeters by 9 millimeters. And you want to make sure that touchscreen gestures are not being shut off, or that they can be used in a different manner. And also device manipulation gestures are enabled through the system because both Android and iOS do have accessibility features built in that enable you to set your own manipulation gestures. And again, in line with touch target size and spacing, you want to make sure that when you're placing buttons, that they're in a place that are easy to access, because people who are blind using an iPhone will actually scan the perimeter of a touch screen in order to find out where landmarks are on a page. So placing them in easy to access places makes it easier for people to identify the components in your application. Next, so for understandable, you want to make sure that if users, your application can adjust to the orientation that it's put into. Some people have their devices fixed to to like a wheelchair or something. So you want to make sure that if you support landscape and portrait, you want to make sure that you have consistent layout across your different screens. And this helps everybody. This doesn't help just people with accessibility issues. This helps everyone, because the last thing you want to do is get lost in the application. The next one for positioning important page elements before the scroll. Again, it's so that anything that's really critical for people to use, it's right there, because if something is below the fold, if someone can't see the screen, they won't know to find that. And that's a really critical thing, to make sure that you put all of the most important controls at a place that's immediately present on the screen. grouping operable elements that perform the same action. So if you have two links that go to the same place and they're together, you want to make sure that they are actually grouped. Next, 4.5. I find this one really interesting because the current design language that iOS uses, and actually the material design for Android as well, is starting to go away from these clear indicators. They're moving away from graphical buttons to buttons that are more text-based. And I've interviewed a few people with accessibility issues and who've been blind or low vision, and they find this to be a bit of a problem in that sometimes like an arrow is not labeled, and they would really prefer a label so that way it's clear to them what the action is that they're going to be committing. And lastly, when dealing with making sure that things are understandable, instructions. Instructions are really critical, so that way you want to make sure that your instructions that for how people use your application are readily accessible, and that they provide instructions on how to manipulate the application if it involves some sort of gesture as well. And last, let's get into robust. So when the virtual keyboard appears on a screen, if it's within field elements, and if you're asking for someone's name, it's probably a clear, you can have a good idea that they'll be entering just text. So you want to make sure that the correct keyboard appears. Or if it's a field that only takes phone numbers, only the number keypad should appear, because that makes things a lot easier for people who, again, either can't see the screen or have a very hard time seeing. Instead of forcing them to switch the keyboard into a numeric keypad for something that only accepts numbers, make sure that the numeric keypad shows up. So the correct kind of keyboard is a critical component of that. So you need to identify within each individual field element what kind of data is going to be taken by that keyboard. And this relates to providing easy methods for data entry. You want to make sure that whatever types of data entry you need from a user, it can be actually ascertained in multiple ways. So either from a keyboard, by speech, by touch. And so the good thing is that a lot of these systems now can accept these things by default. Almost every single keyboard has that microphone on it. But you want to make sure that you can support all of them in your application. And this relates to supporting the characteristics of the individual platforms. Make sure that if iOS does certain things in a certain way, that your application does it in that manner. But that also means that you need to make sure that if your user has the ability to override the settings for font size, that you honor those settings, that your application suddenly goes, well, no, I'm sorry, this is just locked in at 12 point and it's not going to get any bigger. And that's a real burden for people who have changed their settings, and your application should honor their settings. Okay, so now let's get into the test criteria. So you want to make sure that your success criteria is objective and satisfies the requirements. And at the same time, you want to make sure that they address issues directly related to accessibility. We're not talking about general usability. If you're doing testing for accessibility, the test should really only deal with issues faced by people with disabilities. The success criteria means that things must be testable. You have to have some sort of fail or success that a human or a machine can determine. So this comes into the issue that the human doing the testing should also be knowledgeable. The key thing is that within working groups, it's better if there is a specific person who deals with accessibility issues than trying to spread that knowledge throughout the entire team, because then kind of nobody owns it. It is possible for an entire group, but since this is a field that is consistently moving, you want to make sure that someone is there watching out. And this can be done in lots of different ways. Since we currently don't have any legislation in BC that forces us to adhere to these requirements, you can set up a Google alert. And suddenly if you put in BC accessibility, Google will tell you if there is an issue with inaccessibility, but develop internal knowledge and make sure that someone is consistently keeping that information up to date as the technology changes. So within your test groups, you can task someone with learning this, and that way that person can become a center of knowledge for the entire team. Because you need to verify the functionality, and so you need to have someone with knowledge and experience to be able to verify if things are working in the correct manner or not. And lastly, it's really recommended that you do some form of usability testing with people with the specific disabilities that you're targeting, because say for instance, you know that you have a user base that has a lot of visual impairment, so you're going to target screen readers first. Talk to people and get them and bring them in and see what issues they face. I can pretend to be a blind person by turning on the screen shade on my iOS device or on my laptop. It's still not the same as someone who lives with this day in and day out, and you will learn so much by just talking to them, because they'll tell you about things that you didn't realize because you don't live with this every day. And this just is a component of user-centered design practice, and it's really, really important that we understand the specific limitations that everyone faces in the technologies that they try to use. All right, so the last bit of the success criteria that we're going to deal with is, again, there's 3 different conformance levels. In order to be conforming to a specific level, you have to adhere to all of the parameters for it. And that does mean a full web page. If you're talking about a web page, it's not just a component of a web page. You can claim that, yes, your navigation is conforming, but if nothing else below it is, then you've got a problem. You're not technically conforming. So the full page is a critical component of that, and making sure that you're testing the full page. You need to make sure that you are also testing complete processes. So it's not just testing in the login widget, it's testing in the entire user flow for someone logging in, checking something, and then logging back out. Or registering for something. What is that entire user flow like? And again, we want to make sure that we are testing for accessibility supported ways of using technologies. So again, your test should only be limited to the parameters of dealing with accessibility issues, because you want to make sure that you're not interfering with the accessibility, the assistive technology that the person is using. So you need to make sure that your product is not inadvertently stopping the assistive technology from doing its job. And let's move on to the techniques. So the good thing about the techniques is that they're considered informative, so they're not required, but we do at least have a level of sufficiency, so we know when something has met the criteria. But again, there's also additional advisory techniques that can suggest ways to make improvements. However, you're not bound by those. And lastly, you also want to make sure that you are acknowledging and addressing failures. Because if someone can't complete the success criteria, you need to make sure that you're addressing what is considered or what is happening in that failure. Now, I showed you earlier the WCAG specification, but I wanted to show you something else that I actually prefer using. I actually don't find the WCAG document to be very good for doing work directly out of, but there is this really handy website from the W3C that lets you do all sorts of filtering. So let me jump into that so you can get a sense of what that looks like. So you see that it's got the entire list of contents, but I actually tend to live more in the filter because I can then shut off AA and AAA since I don't have to adhere to that. We don't do anything with Silverlight, so I can shut that off. And the great thing is that this technology section covers all of the possible technologies. Oftentimes people think that when we're talking about accessibility relating to websites and other computer-based technologies, that PDF doesn't fall into that, but it actually does. There are specific requirements for that, as well as there are for Flash. But if you don't want to worry about that, you can also shut that off and see how the requirements change. And the nice thing is that also you've got these nice nested techniques that you can use, and you can filter down to sufficiency. This is a really great way of just narrowing down to what is specific to your work group. I really prefer this as a way of navigating the WCAG document. Let's go back to the presentation. You may have noticed that in the technology section there was a thing called ARIA in there. I want to address this just briefly because it's very, very new. The specification for this just landed in 2014. ARIA is dealing with accessible, rich internet applications. So if you built something in JavaScript or you built something in Ajax, that is not going to be accessible just out of the box. HTML5 has a lot of semantics built into it, and they really recommend that you use those elements that are semantic. However, some things are not semantic. So what ARIA does is it's a type of code that you can add to your JavaScript to make things that aren't semantic. So they suddenly add that level of information that a screen reader can hook onto and actually comprehend, and you can navigate through really complex applications. Or say if you have a page with some dynamic content, like you have a stock ticker, for instance, and if that stock changes, the price for that stock changes, you can actually have an ARIA trigger that will inform the user, and you can set that to being assertive, so the minute that stock price goes up or goes down, you alert the user right away, or you can set it to a more passive, you can have a passive setting, so the user completes whatever action they were doing, and then it goes, hey, by the way, the stock for Apple went down, sorry. And so you can actually build all that into things that are not semantic and otherwise not able to be read by screen readers. This also makes it easier to change keyboard focus to page elements. So instead of having just skipping nav, you can actually set landmarks to different regions of your page, and it's much easier for people to skip around to different pages. And this greatly increases keyboard and screen reader accessibility. So this is something that's coming down the pipeline, and I want you all to be aware of it because it will be in a lot of, it will be used by most web developers in the future because this really adds a lot of critical functionality. So let's get into some automated scanning technology. So the good thing is that you can check for a lot of bugs and issues using software. Again, the good folks at W3C have made an evaluations tool list. So let's jump into that as well. So again, you can set filters for the amount of guidelines that you want. You can set languages, technologies, and types. So if you want English or Czech, the type of tool, so you have everything from authoring plugins to things that are specific to CSS and HTML, and also licensing. So you can get things that are free, you can get things that are commercial and enterprise, or open source. So there's a lot of stuff that you can find out there. And if you're new to accessibility, I don't recommend jumping straight into an enterprise solution. I would say test with some free software, get an understanding of what's going on, and then move on to some sort of enterprise tools. We here at Central One do use automated scanning, and we do have an enterprise tool. I live within VanQ Systems product called WorldSpace, which is locally hosted as a server. So it runs automatic scanning. The good thing about this is that since we host it internally, there's no calls out to our externally, so we don't have to deal with compliance issues regarding our data going to the internet. Another group that has produced a piece of automated scanning software is SSBART, and they have something they call AMP. And this one is hosted online. It may be hosted locally, but since we had WorldSpace before I showed up, I haven't dug too far into SSBART, but I wanted to make sure that I acknowledged that there's more than just VanQ's product. The good thing is that both of these can do entire domain scanning. They're not just limited to a single web page. They can also sometimes automatically create reports for you. The other additional good thing is that they can also provide a degree of support for you. So that way if you have any issues with the software, you have someone who will help you. In addition to not just helping you with the technology in and of itself, They also can provide some form of training and education. Both SSBART and VanQ offer universities, online universities, so you don't have to build up an entire bank of accessibility information within your organization. They have lots of training that you can already you can learn from, and your entire team can learn from as well. And last but not least, I want to acknowledge that there's this thing called the Automated Accessibility Testing Tool, and this is made by PayPal, and it lives on Git, and it can be integrated within your environment. So you don't have to build your own tool. You can bring it into, and it supports Selenium and other testing suites. So there are lots of options out there, and I just want to quickly show you some of these interfaces for some of these pieces of software. So this is what WorldSpace looks like. I just did a quick test scan to show you what the success and failures look like. I'm not actually going to dive into any of these tools, but I can do so after the presentation, mostly just for the sake of time. The tools also are not just web-based, they can also be browser-based as well. There's lots of web plugins or browser plugins that you can get. Axe by VanQ is their open source JavaScript library, and that can also be fit into Selenium as well if you use that. And again, it's also a browser plugin, so you can start doing some scanning by just inspecting an element, and it'll scan the entire page for you. So this is the page for the SSBART University. SSBART University. So it shows you all the information you can get, and you can register online for this for free. You then have to pay to get into the specific details, but I just wanted to show you the amount and types of information that are present for you. So there's everything from awareness down to specifics of mobile and web accessibility. Next, this is the Git page for PayPal's AATT tool. We can jump into the website later. I just want to make sure that we're moving along. It's taking a while. And lastly, another free tool that's out there that's made by WebAIM is called Wave. And this is a free tool that they've posted online. You stick in a URL and it'll scan for you. It's totally free. They also have a Chrome plugin that you can use, and so you can test any page at any moment without having to go back to the Wave tool. So it's really handy, and again, totally free. And WebAIM is a really good resource. I have on my slide deck, I have a bunch of URLs. So I'll make sure that everyone has access to all of those URLs, so you all don't have to go and track these down. So I have all of that prepared for you. And lastly, we want to deal with manual testing.
Question about tools. Do you check any desktop application, any tools that you can use for this?
I'm sure you can. It's just that since we are entirely web-based, that's where I've really sort of been digging in. But I'm sure there are.
On the same W?
Yeah, I would go to the page that has all of the types of tools that are available. You may be able to run scans on desktop software using the VanQ tools. I just never have tried. So I'm pretty sure that you could. And the SSBART is really robust. When they were doing a free trial in April, so I was poking around as to what their offering is like, and they offer all sorts of scanning. There was even a section for iOS, so it's a very robust system. So I would be shocked if it couldn't. I just haven't tried. But definitely try the free stuff first. All right, so manual testing. Manual testing is really critical. The thing that's really interesting about the WCAG guidelines is that you can technically adhere to them and still not be a usable product. This is one of the funny little conundrums about accessibility. You can do all your solutions based on the automated testing, but if you never dive into it by using a screen reader, you will be surprised by how many difficulties you can run into. So do not think that by complying to an automated scanner that you're completely done. You need to take that additional step further and make sure that the functionality itself is actually fully there by doing manual testing of some of these things. So for desktop, That means making sure that on a Mac, catch up. That on a Mac that you turn on VoiceOver, and that can be done really simply. Once you go into the accessibility settings within system preferences, you can turn on VoiceOver by just hitting Command F5 and you're already testing. And then you can also turn a screen shade on, and it is super disorienting. I've at times tried to use our products as a fully blind user by shutting the screen off, and it's a real trip, even if you know the product and if you know where you're supposed to be going. It is surprising, and I really recommend that you try this in your own products as you're making sure that you're compliant. PCs. There's a bunch of different screen readers. Because VoiceOver is already baked into OS X, nobody bothers making any additional type of accessibility software for the Mac. But for the PC, it's a totally different world. JAWS is the most famous one, and it's also really expensive. So there's another solution called NVDA, which is free. And so a lot of people have started to shift to that, and they're actually very aggressive about their development for being a free product. They're constantly doing updates. So I wouldn't be surprised if NVDA takes over JAWS in the next few years. If you're curious about statistics for usage of screen readers and technology, WebAIM has an entire survey that they do every year in July, where they ask people to submit what things they're using. So you can learn a lot more from that. WebAIM is a really good resource for all sorts of accessibility knowledge. The other one that I've listed there is Zoom Text. When I interviewed someone who has macular degeneration, she's a 26-year-old woman who basically has the eyes of an 80-year-old person. And she, because she's not fully blind, she uses Zoom Text, which is a tool that lets her enlarge the text on her screen. So there's lots of different methods that people use for achieving accessibility, and you want to make sure you try them all. For mobile, because of the much more stringent requirements of mobile devices and operating systems, they've already got accessibility baked into them. So in iOS, you again have VoiceOver, which has been ported over from the Mac. And for Android, you have TalkBack, which is their version of accessibility or VoiceOver. And there's lots of other plugins you can get. You can get different voices for TalkBack. The Android world is a lot more flexible in terms of the amount of tools that you can add to that. Whereas on iOS, it's really just VoiceOver and the zooming features and even the magnifying loop. Apple's actually very aggressive in making sure that they're helping people with accessibility issues, and they actually won an award last year from the American National Institute for the Blind. So the VoiceOver is currently the gold standard for accessibility technology. When we're doing manual testing, so that's the components of manual testing. So how are we actually going to do manual testing? You want to make sure, again, like any good tester, you determine your test plan. So that means identifying the platform that you're going to try and tackle. You want to make sure that you have a clear sense of which features and functionality you're testing. You want to identify that your user flow is clear to you, and you want to make sure that you have a clear parameter for what you consider a success or failure. And lastly, the one thing that I highly recommend doing is when you're doing testing for accessibility features is do a screen recording. It's pretty easy to do on a Mac. Using QuickTime, you can capture an iOS device or your own screen. On a PC, it's a slightly different story where you can get something like TextSmith or other types of screen capturing technology. But at least it'll let you review things and take screen grabs of it afterwards, so you can express what's going on to the developer instead of stepping back through the entire process. So I really recommend doing some sort of screen recording. And that really takes us to the end. I didn't drill into specific practices because I wanted to make sure everyone understood what's involved in WCAG. But in closing, I want to make sure that everyone has a clear understanding that we need to make sure that when we're trying to address issues related to accessibility, that we determine the audience and the specific issues that each have. sometimes something that's a solution for one group may be a hindrance for another. So you want to make sure that you are acknowledging the different types of disability and that you're taking the individuals into consideration. Stay aware of legislation. So because these are coming down the pipeline, again, you can set up a Google alert, and you can watch what Ontario is doing because their laws are progressive. So they're probably the model that the rest of Canada is going to follow. I can't see everyone, the federal government, just forcing everyone into single A compliance within like a year. Like you need to give people a long lead time. Make sure that you start learning the specifications, so that means working your way through the documents. And there's lots of online tools that will help you learn that as well. You want to make sure that you identify the scope of the type of testing that you're doing for identifying and remediating these issues. So you want to make sure that you're doing both manual and automated testing, because the only way in which you can truly verify whether or not a user flow is achievable is by going through it yourself. Identify which tools are useful to your environment. If you don't have a huge budget, the good thing is that there's a lot of free stuff out there. But you want to make sure that you are using the best tool for your work. And lastly, share what you know. The amount of knowledge around accessibility is still growing, so we need to socialize a lot of these concepts within our organizations and within the entire country of Canada in general. So share what you know, and make sure that if you find something that really works well for you, that you share that with everyone around you. So because the only way in which we can move everybody forward is by collaborating on this, because we're helping everyone. The thing that I find really amazing about accessibility is that this is the one place in which we're literally helping people. Every single time we make something much more usable, we're enabling someone to have an independence that they've never had before. And that means that they can do things faster and better so they can get on with their lives. We can actually do that. Thank you. Do you want to see a test? Do you want me to scan something for you? How's everyone feeling?
Yes.
Yes. Do you want to see what it's like to scan something? All right. So we'll use Wave, just so you can see what kind of report it brings up. I'm going to grab. So the good folks at WebAIM have developed these pages, or this page, that explicitly does have an accessibility issue within it. So I'm going to use that rather than trying to point the finger at anybody. So let's see what that turns up. So the Wave tool here, you see there, it's found 38 errors. And if you click on the little flag on the side, it'll show you where those are. So you see issues here: linked image, missing alternate text, spacer image, missing alternate text, suspicious link text. And then if you click on the little bubble here, it tells you what it means, why it matters, and how to fix it. So this free online tool is pretty robust and will help you even drill down into the specific legislation, so or into the specifics of the specification. So yeah, I can also show you how world space works, so you can get a sense of what it does. I'm not going to show you anything. Oh.
I have a question about that Wave tool.
About which one?
It came up with a lot of errors, but are those just things that you should put your focus your attention on, or are those all things that need to get fixed?
I would say if it's identified something as a full-on error, that absolutely has to get fixed, because those are probably things that are make it so that people can't actually use the web page. Like say 19 images are missing alternate text. That means that as the person is navigating their way through the page, they'll hear something like image. Great. And that means that they don't have context for what you're presenting them. So that the interesting thing about that is people who have accessibility issues have a very low threshold for what they're going to put up with. And the two people that I've interviewed have told me repeatedly that if they turn on if they go to a website and if they start running into problems, they leave and they never come back. So they're very quick to abandon something. And the interesting thing is that both of those users that I've interviewed have said to me that they've used their mobile device more than any other device because it's the most accessible to them. So mobile, if you're actually thinking about specific targeting and if you're dealing with mobile, that's actually the more critical one. And those are the places where you should probably do the most fixes because they've probably already abandoned their desktop by this point. Like the one woman I interviewed only uses her desktop for things she absolutely has to and otherwise will completely avoid it. So that tells you how powerful mobile has been in terms of enabling people. And that also kind of tells us how bad the general web has been. The open web is actually a pretty sketchy territory for them, so they've had to sort of find other solutions for their issues. So if something in the scanner comes up as a full-on error, that's something I would consider critical and would try to remediate as soon as possible. Things that are alerts, it means that it's not going to break their experience probably, but you probably want to make sure that everything's okay. And that's the point where those are the things I would manually test just to see, like, oh, is this just because like the way we've coded it, it thinks it's an error, but it's not technically an error. We've had issues with that internally where I've had a stack of Jira tickets that I handed a team and said, hey, go fix these header issues because these headers are out of sequence. And then the team came back and said, well, actually, the way that this is fully rendered on our end product, that's fine. It will not actually do that. And so I'm like, all right. So then I go clear off the tickets and we're done. So you need to make sure that you're at least doing that process to determine whether or not the scanner, because it will turn up false positives. I'm not going to lie to you. They actually will turn up some. And you can start to tweak the tools, especially for the ones that you pay for, to make sure that those don't start to pop up again. Yeah, so the interesting thing is that I want to show you that page, because outside of the scanner, the good thing is that they've got these annotations that they've developed for this page, and this is a good instructional tool where it'll tell you why the issue is what it is. So you don't actually have to run the scanner through this because they've already deliberately done it. And so wherever you see these little numbers, it shows you a specific issue that is present. So this is a good sort of place where you can start to get a grounding for what kind of issues you run into. And the more time you spend identifying these, they become second nature. You start to spot them without even working very hard. So they've done a version of it that's both clean and that's bad. So there's the accessible and inaccessible version. We can also scan a live page. My favorite one to test is actually the BC government. So they have an accessibility initiative called BC 2024. And they're working on fixing things. But I want to show you, like, I'm deliberately picking on the government because they're the largest entity. But at the same time, it'll show you what a live site turns into. Let's go here. I'm going to go to Acts. That's not how you do it. So you go to Inspect. And you see here in my developer tools, Acts has added itself. That's just a big button that I press, Analyze. And it's found 24 violations. So form elements must have labels. That's a really common one. Making sure that if you have a form element, that the label that's associated is clear. Links must have discernible text. And elements that should not have a tab index greater than 0. So tab index is something that's really interesting because things that are not within the tab order can be given a placement within the tab order, but you have to be careful about how you use that because you may end up making a mistake. Or sometimes because you can actually dictate a tab order, sometimes people are like, great, I can force people into it, and it's like, no, don't do that. You want to make sure that things are just added so that, because you want to treat people who are using screen readers like a regular user. Regular users don't follow a linear path. They jump around all over the place. And we want to try to enable people to do the same thing. So again, like these violations range from, you see at the top, right? So this one is serious, but this one is critical. So that means that people are not going to be able to solve that problem on their own. And the good thing is, again, that this free browser plugin gives you a really good set of information regarding the specific elements. If you click on more info, and then it drives you straight into the rules.
Sorry, that
Just take a second. And so there you see critical, who's affected, the rule, the why, and how to fix. So, and again, this is entirely free, so you don't have to spend anything to at least start getting a grounding for where your product is.
you had a question?
Yeah, actually I have one. So is this application is good for the mobile application as well?
This one is not. They're talking. So the Q's World Space is going to have a mobile component coming. It's just not in the current version. So it's in the pipeline, and I've never tried the SS part one. I just saw that there is something for iOS. I just don't know what that is. So.
Also, like for that, we need to install one plugin X, and after that, we can type like a Vavian.org. Is that like that?
Sorry?
Like X is like a plugin. We need to install like a plugin here, and after that, we need to type like a Vavian.org. That's all.
Nope. So for Axe, all you do is inspect. So you right-click, go to inspect an element. I don't know how many of you use the debugger on a web browser on Chrome, but you basically just go to inspect element, and Axe just adds itself to the developer tools. So it's right there.
It's like a bug tracker or something in Mozilla?
Yeah, it's kind of that.
Okay.
And they offer, that's also in Firefox as well. And Mozilla does a lot of work as well.
Yeah, so and Vavian.org is totally different. Like you just type the URL there and after that they scan the website.
But they also have a browser plugin as well, so you don't have to leave the page that you're on to go type that URL.
Okay.
You just, actually I can turn that on right now so you can see. So again, PC. There's the plugin right there.
That's true.
And you'll just see it come up in a second. So here it found 53 errors. So again, you can start drilling into what's going on. So missing form labels. So at least there is some consistency between the two scans. They're both found form label issues. Yeah.
When you're manually testing using like different screen readers, do you have any preferences of which ones to choose? Because I know like NVDA and VoiceOver, they all like read the DOM differently, so like presented different, and it's hard to like cater to like.
That's the basic challenge. Like Dragon just started. So the three big ones are Dragon Naturally Speaking, JAWS, and then NVDA. They are all slightly different. I've actually only been focused on Mac in our world, our work world, but that's testing screen readers on PCs is part of my work for this year. So that's the next phase. Is that now that I understand iOS, because the other thing about VoiceOver on mobile is that it has a rotor. I think it's also in. On the desktop, but I've never used the rotor, and I've never had a user tell me that they use the rotor, where you literally rotate, and you can set different parameters to read out, or you can jump from link to link or header to header. So it does spiral out. So the challenge is like trying to end that in.
You're gonna have some real challenges because like for us, like we've done a lot of testing on the desktop or on Windows platform, and just the fact that like tabbing works and it's all good, but then as soon as you switch over to VoiceOver, it seems like the OS is overrunning the whole tab DOM structure, and it's just how do I go about this? Like it's such a big problem.
Yeah, and that's identified in the webbing documents as well, that they all acknowledge that. That's part of the reason why Apple wins awards. Because voiceover is very consistent in its behavior.
Yeah.
And actually, I've even read articles where people have given up on Mac, gone back to PC, and then gone, no, and then went back. Like, they've written entire articles about that.
Okay.
So the challenge is identifying which is used most by your user base and targeting those specifically. So it does become a process of learning more about who your audience is. So it does take you outside the realm of traditional testing, and it starts going into usability testing and marketing potentially. So you need to coordinate those groups to make sure that they all understand what you're trying to achieve. Because they might have that data for you, right? About like who's using what, or what is your primary platform. Because once you have a primary platform, you start looking at those tools most closely, because if anyone's using that, then if you have a very dominant platform, the odds are they'll be using one of those three. And the JAWS is expensive too, so the licenses aren't cheap for it. So if your workplace is okay with buying and testing those things, but I know I'm in for a whirl. I've heard a lot about it, but I'm eager. I'm really curious to see what the difference is, especially because I'm much more personally invested in the Mac platform. So it's the thing I know best.
Could you say something about approaches or tools for testing mobile web applications with responsive device, which can have different content depending on the resolution of the device? How do you usually test?
That's, again, something we're just getting into. I've been working closely with the mobile team this year, so I'm just now learning with it. Unfortunately, I don't have a clear answer for you, because responsive, if people didn't hear the question, it was about how do you test for responsive designs, because responsive does strip out some of the content, so how do you know which is happening? For now, I would just manually test it. Test it at a couple of different resolutions. I would say start an iPad, go to an iPhone, and then, because they actually behave slightly differently. I was surprised when I tested an iPad mini with in our application, and I found that it behaved differently. So even then, within iOS, which is the more consistent one, different form factors will behave slightly differently. So at this point, I would say manually test and record the screen. Until I learn more about the automated testing tools, I would say just do some of that across the two main sizes and see what happens. Because the iPhone tends to be pretty consistent, but the jump was to the iPad, and I noticed that there was differences there. So for now, I would say just do a bit of manual testing. Record the desktop, record the iPad, and then record the phone just to see what happens. But the best thing you can do is just turn on VoiceOver and see what the result is. I will start digging into more of the automated mobile tools, but because I'm waiting for DQ, I kind of don't want to invest too much effort into something, because both DQ and SSBark are in the tens of thousands of dollars, so like you're not going to jump around between them very quickly. I hope that answered. Anyone else?
Could you please elaborate a bit on input-output devices that normally people use, people with disabilities?
Okay.
Like you mentioned, braille.
Yeah, so the braille readers are a small attachment that people plug into their laptop or PC, and even iOS devices. From my understanding of it is that it has controls built into it, so they just navigate entirely from the device itself. I've only ever seen videos. I've actually been contacting the Canadian Deafblind Association to go talk to them. I've also been in contact with the CNIB about going and finding users specifically that have those, because I've never witnessed anyone use one, and I would really like to see what that is. So again, it's direct observation. Get in touch with the community groups like the CNIB or the Canadian Deafblind Association and start seeing that, because there's actually several different types of assistive technologies. It's not just those little braille readers. Sometimes people used to have magnifiers, but a lot of that is going away because of tablets and smartphones. So that's something that I'm still learning about. So I would say go to WebAIM and start digging into what they say about different types of add-ons that people have to computers. But right now, I can't tell you about my direct experience with it because I'm still researching that. So once I do, I'll report back. If you give me your email address, I'll just let you know what I find. Anybody else? Do you want me to turn on VoiceOver on the Mac so you can see what it reads out?
Robotic voice. Robotic voice.
Yeah, it is. It is
VoiceOver on Chrome, PC homepage, Province of British Columbia window, how to meet WCAG 2.0, tab 1 of 9. Full, filter, collapsed, errors, 5 of 3, checkbox list 5 items. You are currently on heading level 3. VoiceOver off.
I'll close that because I don't think we'll need that. Here, let's go to the GitHub page for the automated accessibility testing tool so you can see. Okay, so here it is. Turn that on.
VoiceOver on Chrome, GitHub, PayPal/AATT, automated accessibility testing tool window, GitHub, PayPal/AATT, automated accessibility testing tool, HTML content has keyboard focus. You are currently on HTML content. To enter the web area, press Control, Option, Shift, down arrow.
You can also press
Link.
tab.
You must be signed into Watch repository. List the items. You are link 2.4. You are currently on a link. To click this link, press
See the little
Control,
square
Option,
thing
space. Link. You must be signed into Star repository. You are currently on a link. To click this link, press Control, Option, space.
So you'll see it jump over there. The challenge for the user experience for people using screen readers is that your entire product gets turned into a straight line. That's one of the reasons that ARIA is so important down the road, is that you'll be able to set different landmarks and people will be able to jump to specific landmarks. Because otherwise, imagine having to read your entire website from left to right. It's difficult. And again, I really welcome you to try what these are like, so you can get a sense of that.
By landmarks, they mean shortcuts, keyboard shortcuts.
The landmark would be like different regions of the page. So like these tabs could be landmarks. You can say like tab navigation, and then if the user searches is using the VoiceOver feature so that they can move around by landmark, they can jump around to those different sort of, because the landmarks are supposed to be highest level, so like your navigation, your left nav, or other things. So that's what I mean by landmarks. And then you can get down to specific links, like you can tune it to switch to links and things. That's what that means. Yes?
So what do you recommend to do if one tool, if you resolve all the violations by one tool, but still complaints by another tool?
I would try to dig into why it's causing that error in another one. Because there are slight variances between how each one interprets things. You've run into that. The VoiceOver on the Mac is a little bit more consistent, but I don't know, maybe you can speak to that.
For sure. We've had some, like the HTML code sniffer, like Wiz. There's a bunch of them online, and it's kind of like you have to dig into what the actual issues are, because some of them will say a compliant, but okay, this image is missing an alt text. But then you look at the image, and it's just like a decoration image, so that's not really something that they care about. So it's a lot of like going through what the errors actually say, and then looking into whether if it's like a tab index, so maybe you're not keyboard navigated, you can't navigate to that location using your keyboard. So those stuff are usually, it's like CSS fixes usually that you have to be compliant and stuff like that.
Yeah, because I don't have the experience right now of testing our products against multiple different screen readers. Yeah. This is actually the first real deep dive in our organization that I've been doing in terms of our user. Like, it's the shift, like, is it on or not, to like, what is this experience like? And that's a major jump. But if I got an error in one and I didn't get it in the other, I would sort of assume that it's probably okay, unless if the error was like really significant, where like suddenly like if it's not actually getting there, that might actually be even a quirk of the screen reader, and the user may have their own workaround, because they all have very specific quirks. You want to make sure that you're trying to at least remediate as much of it as you can on your end of things, because it may be a screen reader. The reality is that, and you can't own the bugs in the screen reader, because all software has bugs, right? I mean, let's not kid ourselves. But that means that also that you want to make sure that that truly is a bug on the reader, and check their own documentation, because they may be aware of it and they just haven't gotten around to fixing it. So that may be a factor of it as well, as digging into what the screen reader itself is doing in the background. Yeah. So
Sorry, continuing along with the variations and things like that, do you see a huge difference between all the different web browsers?
There is, Chrome has been pretty good. Safari is also good, but it's also kind of perky in the sense that you've got to turn on certain things in the system preferences. Chrome and Google has actually been also driving at this very, like a pretty decent amount of intensity. So I primarily test Chrome, Safari, and then sometimes I go into Firefox. WorldSpace only really works within Firefox. Like you have to use Firefox to use some of the features for it. So I'm in there for bugs, but I'm not spending a huge amount of time in that. But they, like all the browsers behave slightly differently, especially since the fork with WebKit. That now that since Google and Apple don't get along regarding WebKit, we're all kind of at a loss for that. So it's an unfortunate after effect of they're not like nice with each other anymore regarding this. So. But again, it's like resolving any cross-browser issue, right?
Like, I know for like NVDA, it's like mostly supported for like Firefox, and I believe Google Chrome has their own like voiceover application that they're using now. So it's like,
it's a variant of TalkBack that lives within Chrome itself. So they've got their own tools, and because also Chrome is like part of their Chrome OS, so I'm assuming that that's why they're porting that over to that space. But Google has amazing resources online as well. They have entire sections dedicated to accessibility, and they have a lot of YouTube videos. So if you are doing things specifically within Chrome or within Android, they've got a lot of information already for that. So if you're working within their parameters and their environment, they have their own unique way to solve the problem. So yeah, unfortunately, it's still cross-browser. I don't even know what Opera does. So I'm like you always have to set a limit as to like how far you're willing to take your testing. And also the screen readers often admit that they work better with certain browsers. So I think people who use those will generally just stick to whatever is running. At least in my experience. I'm doing more interviews, so like that's part of it is that I'm still learning a lot more directly from our user base, what sort of things that they're doing, what they'd like to see. Anyone else? All right. Well, it's 8 o'clock almost, so I don't know how everyone's doing. It's been a long day for most of us, I think. So thank you for coming. If you need any more information, please feel free to contact me, and we'll keep going.